Do you have a preteen in your household? What do they believe? Well, new research from the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University found that 8 to 12-year-olds are on track to abandon biblical Christianity. Only 21% believe turning to the Bible is the best way to determine right from wrong. Well, here to explain more of the findings is Cultural Research Center Director, he's Director of Research, George Barna. George, this appears to be a troubling trend. What else did you discover in your research?
Well, as we looked at all this, really what we're trying to understand is how are children doing in terms of developing the foundations for a biblical worldview. We talk about 7 particular beliefs called the 7 cornerstones of a biblical worldview. There are 5 in particular here where children really are in jeopardy when we look at what they believe about the Bible, what they believe about absolute truth, about the means to eternal salvation, about how to define and pursue success and the purpose of life. In all of those areas, they're not doing well. And when we compare them to teenagers and young adults, in other words, if we backtrack in terms of age groups, we find that today's young children are doing worse than their predecessors. And we already know that their predecessors do not have a biblical worldview. So we're looking at a young group of people that is not moving toward thinking like Jesus, which is important because that's the only way that eventually you're going to be able to act like Jesus, because you do what you believe.
Well, what's the cause then, George, of this biblical abandonment for preteens?
Well, there's no single cause that we can point to, but there are a number of things that certainly contribute to that. One of those would be the enduring and negative impact of media messages upon children. The media continue to be the most impactful source of worldview development in our country. Secondly, we can look at the fact that only 4% of parents have a biblical worldview. They don't perceive themselves as being the ones who are responsible for developing the worldview of their children. Thirdly, we can look at the fact that most Christian churches these days neither prioritize children in ministry nor focus on worldview development when they have the attention of children within the church environment. So you add those and a few other things together, what the church, what the schools are doing, the influence of peers and so forth. And so it's a big turnaround that's got to happen. And parents need to be leading that turnaround, but it's not foremost in their minds to do so.
Well, I was going to say, I'm sure you weren't surprised by these results because I know you've discussed this for quite a few years now about this trend of adults moving away from the Christian faith, declining church attendance, decline in moral clarity, biblically based principles. So what then is at the heart of this for the parents?
Yeah, I mean, this was all part of a book that I just put out called Raising Spiritual Champions, the idea of which is to get parents invested in the worldview development of their children. And in order to do that, I talk about how there's several things that they've got to engage with. Number one is they've got to have a plan. This doesn't happen spontaneously. Number two, they have to know what beliefs they're going to focus on and interact with their children on regularly in order to get them to the right place. Thirdly, they've got to be thinking through how do we convert those right beliefs into right behavior? And then fourthly, how do you evaluate how your child is doing? What's the parent's role in that? And what can they do based on the different evaluations that they may come up with?
There was a bright spot here. You found a higher percentage of preteens than teens believe that Jesus is the way to eternal salvation. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is that as children have been looking at this and evaluating the opportunities that they have for addressing the sin issue in their life, many of them are at least aware of the fact that Jesus may be their best answer and is their best answer. The challenge, of course, is that, again, when we look at it generationally, what we see is when children reach those teen years, there tends to be a loss in terms of the proportion of young people who ultimately decide that Jesus is the answer to the sin problem. We see that with today's teenagers, and we're hoping that doesn't happen with young children. but we have to be prepared for that pattern continuing.
Okay, quickly then, I know you touched upon this, but what should our churches and parents do then about this?
Well, recognize that disciples make disciples and that it's the parent's primary responsibility to be helping their child to become a disciple. And so having that plan, as I talked about a few moments ago, but also recognizing that as the chief discipler of their children, they've got to invest in the relationship. They've got to understand that their own behavior is huge in this process. So they've got to be a great role model. They have to know how they're planning to take their child into this process of becoming a disciple of Jesus. And they've got to be invested in consistent Socratic dialogue with their children, not beating them over the head with biblical principles, but asking questions of their children about what they believe, why they believe it, what kind of lifestyle that's going to produce, what kind of person they're going to become if they embrace certain beliefs.
It's all about time and relationship, is it not? People could read more, find out more by reading your book, Raising Spiritual Champions, Nurturing Your Child's Heart, Mind, and Soul. George Barna, thank you for sharing with us. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Gary.